So hi, everybody. I'm Julie Enslow. I'm one of the facilitators of 350 Milwaukee, and welcome tonight. A week ago today, the headlines in one section should have been front page, but it was on page 10 of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Read, the United Nations warns that Earth is firmly on the track toward an unlivable world. That's the headlines. And it's referring to the United Nations IPCC report that came out recently, which basically says temperatures on Earth will shoot past a key danger point unless greenhouse gas emissions fall faster than countries have committed. And the world's top body of climate scientists said Monday and warned of the consequences of inaction, but also noting some signs of progress. UN Secretary General said the report by the IPCC revealed, quote, a litany of broken climate promises by governments and corporations, accusing them of stoking global warming by clinging to harmful fossil fuels. It is a file of shame, cataloging the empty pledges that put us firmly on track toward an unlivable world, he said. So this is a dire warning, and time is running out. And if the governments and the corporations are not going to take any responsibility and handle this in a way that suits the emergency that we have upon us, then we have to push the issue even harder. It's up to us to act even more strongly and loudly and in their face. So I, for one, am not going to go down without a fight. And I think the rest of you probably feel that way too, or you wouldn't be at this meeting. And 350 is all about action and taking on this battle to save the planet. So we're just very briefly, we've got a couple of things we could talk about. And that's we're planning for an Earth Day rally in March on Friday, the 22nd, on Earth Day itself, here in Milwaukee, gathering at City Hall at 12 noon. I'm sure you probably have been getting some emails on this. You'll be getting more. And we hope that every single person will bring their friends, their family, and have a really good showing. We're going to have, there's two main demands that the organizing committee has settled on, and that's to aim towards the city to declare a climate emergency. And then secondly, after the march down to Chase Bank, 2 blocks down the street, we will be demanding that Chase Bank stop funding fossil fuels because it's the biggest funder of fossil fuels in the world. After we'll have an action on the plaza there at Chase Bank, we will be coming back to City Hall and closing the rally. So we hope you can, should be about an hour to an hour and a half at the most. And we will, if it's cold and rainy, we'll keep it as short as we can. But we do need to be out there and let the city and let Chase Bank know what our demands are. So tonight we have yes?
Because you just talked about the urgency and what we need to know, that we need to be more urgent. And as we believe in democracy and nonviolence, that means affecting our congressional representatives. At today's steering committee, we talked about a strategic planning. And that's what that's about. And I propose that we do that, the middle to the end of May, so we can get more urgent and put more pressure on our representatives. But that needs to be planned out. And that's a proposal. Can I get a second on it?
Second.
Okay, so please, steering committee, let's plan for that strategic planning middle to the end of May. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Yes, we don't have any time to waste. So are there any other brief announcements that anybody would like to make before we get on with our program? No? Well, then I would like to ask Linda to introduce our speakers tonight because she was the main contact for them. They are Amy Lewis and Gwen Bridge, who are both with us, and talking about nature needs half and the Indigenous leadership that we are fortunate to have in this world and we need to follow. And so, Linda, would you like to proceed with a formal introduction?
Yes, thank you, Julie. I am delighted that 350 Milwaukee is sponsoring tonight's program on Nature Needs Half, and that we are joined by two prominent and knowledgeable leaders in this movement, Amy Lewis and Gwen Bridge. I myself think a lot about how to protect more of our natural lands right here in Milwaukee and across Wisconsin. I think about creating more natural areas at our homes to provide wildlife habitat. I search for a plan to identify the most critical areas for preservation and a plan to connect them. Why? Because it's a matter not only of loving plants, animals, organisms, and natural environments of all types, but also a matter of the future for people on this planet. That's why I was extremely intrigued to learn about the work of Nature Needs Half organization and the Wild Foundation. I will leave it to our speakers to give their explanations of why we need to protect 50% of land in order to protect life on Earth. This will require a major cultural shift that redefines the relationship between people and nature. How might this happen, and what is the role for Indigenous people in this cultural shift? Our speakers have the expertise to share with us on these issues. So let me introduce Amy Lewis. She's a vice president with Wild Foundation. They are the organization that founded and coordinates the international coalition Nature Needs Half. The Nature Needs Half coalition is addressing the root causes threatening our biosphere and helping to transform the relationship between society and nature. It's my pleasure to welcome Amy Lewis, who will start off our program.
Thank you so much, Linda. And it'll be my honor and pleasure to introduce Gwen Bridge. I'm really here just to give a brief rundown on Nature Needs Half, talk about a couple of things related to the Wisconsin wild habitats, especially the Boreal Forest, and then segue into Gwen's presentation, because I think that the knowledge that she has and the experience she has can suggest some vital new alternative strategies we can be utilizing to create a transformative relationship with nature. I want to thank Linda so much for her patience in setting this up and for the invitation. And I also just want to thank everybody here. I was really pleased as punch to listen into the conversation initially, to hear your genuine emotion around the environmental crises facing our planet. And I want to tell you that really the model that I'm pursuing within conservation is very similar to 350.org's model, because I believe in community, I believe in the power of community, and I believe that community is the wellspring of courage for our leaders. And so each and every one of you are basically manufacturing the courage and strength needed for leaders to make better decisions. So thank you so much for the work you do. I want to start off really with a quote, and that is, "In nature, nothing exists alone." This quote came from Rachel Carson's seminal work, Silent Spring. as she documented the pesticide crisis that was facing the United States and frankly still faces the world. And she recognized that in nature, everything is interrelated. And this holds true for the climate crisis and biodiversity. And it also holds true for, I think, the root causes of the problems we face, because we can identify a number of policies and a number of entities that are engaged in the degradation, the ecological degradation of our planet. But ultimately, what this boils down to is a systemic problem related to our relationship with nature as a society. And one could argue that perhaps any civilization's most important relationship is not with other civilizations, but with the natural world upon which they depend. And so as I talk about Nature Needs Half, there'll be facts and there'll be figures, but ultimately for the Wild Foundation, this boils down to a broken relationship with nature that I will get into here as soon as I can share my screen, which I can do right now. So share. Let me put this on. Start slideshow. Here we go. Okay. So I'm going to run through this pretty quickly. Write down your questions if you have them. I want to save as much time for Gwen as possible because she's really the meat of this, offering ideas that are the meat of the solution here. So Nature Needs Half really started with this question of how much nature do people need to survive? And there's a very scientific answer to this. And it's one that has been around, if you look at contemporary science, there's one that's been around for 40, 50 years, since the 1970s, and the Odums were doing research. And if you look at traditional knowledge, you'll also see this pattern dating back for centuries, perhaps millennia. And that answer is approximately half. That doesn't hold true for all ecosystems. Some ecosystems require more. Rainforests need 80%. Grasslands need 40%. But if you look across the planet, we need about half of the planet intact to continue the life-giving services upon which we depend. And I know that with this group, I don't have to name those services, but I will name a few, starting with oxygen production. Over half of our oxygen is produced in the oceans. We also get a lot from trees, and also moving into things related to soil fertility, clean water, abundant water, consistent rainfall patterns, and carbon sequestration. In fact, it's estimated, conservative estimate, that the world's primary forests, not the plantations, but the original native forests, hold at least 100 parts per million carbon, conservative estimate. So if we lose even a fraction of that, we're going to blow past that 450 number, and we all know we need to get down to 350. Turns out also that if we restore wild areas, we can remove a significant amount of carbon from the atmosphere. So nature is obviously playing a huge role in that. So 70% of oxygen comes from wildlife in Earth's oceans. The rest comes from wild areas. We don't produce our own oxygen. Let's see, 100 parts per million carbon stored in Earth's primary forests. And also 1.4 billion people around the planet derive their livelihoods directly from wild areas, whether those are in the oceans or from foraging in forests. 1.4 billion people. So if we're even just looking at direct economic impacts, the human toll of removing wildlands and fragmenting them is enormous. Hold on. So what we're really talking about with half is the concept of tipping points, that should we exceed our place in the web of life, and should we take up more space than half on the planet, we are going to cross a tipping point that's pretty serious. And this is what the Odums talked about in the 1970s. The Odums observed in wetlands that if you degraded more than half of the ecosystem, you got a precipitous drop in the ecological services. It wasn't like, oh, we have 40% of the ecosystem and we have 40% of the services. No, you had 40% of the ecosystem and 5% of the services. So we're talking about tipping points. And the more we fragment wild areas, the more we reduce nature's ability to heal itself and to support our civilization. Let's see here. Let's remove these from the screen. The caveat here is that thresholds for some ecosystems are a lot higher. As I mentioned, the Amazonian rainforest needs 80% intact. And we are essentially at that 80% threshold right now. The Amazon, if it hasn't crossed it already, it's right there. The same holds true with our planet. We are at the 50% threshold right now. We have still about 50% of the planet left to protect. Technically, 26% is still wildlands. We have another 52% that's shared areas, and of those shared areas, about 24% are still ecologically intact. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. Now, in the United States and many other countries, there's a very admirable movement happening. There's 80 countries that have signed on to the Campaign for Nature that's calling for protecting 30 by 30. And I 100% support them. And the leaders of the 30 by 30 movement will be the first to tell you that the science of 30 by 30 is really the science for half. And that 30 by 30 is a political target, much in the same way that 2 degrees is a political target, but 1.5 degrees is the real target. 50% is the real target. If we only have 30% of the planet left in 2030 that's ecologically intact, we're screwed. And my question is, when is it more feasible politically and economically to protect 50% of nature? Right now, when we still have half left to protect, or 30 years in the future, when we've added, no joke, we've added 25 million kilometers of road to the Earth's surface. That's enough road to encircle Earth 600 times. And we've doubled our urban square footage. And we have to restore nature, including extinct species, which are critical to the carbon cycle. We have to restore nature at an unimaginable, like Jurassic Park-like scale. It's just food for thought. Another reason that we need to protect half is the human identity comes from wild areas. And whether we like all go out into the wilderness to be woodsmen and hunter and gatherers or whatever, it doesn't matter, because the attributes that we find most admirable about ourselves, our ingenuity, our adaptability, our resilience, our strength, our endurance, all of these things we inherited from the wild. We inherited this from the wider relations of life, from the predators that hunted us to the prey that we hunted. They're the ones that bestowed upon us these attributes. And so when you ask yourself, what is the human spirit without wilderness, without a wild planet? What happens if we live on a giant planet that's just one big urban area with some gardens in between? What does that do for who we are as a people? Other reasons, in nature, when we return, many of us find a sense of connection. We walk into a wildland and we're all on our own, and yet something feels different. And there's a sense of sanity that is restored, and we don't know why, but it feels right. And finally, oh, I guess there wasn't a finally. I thought I had 4 points there, but maybe it just didn't come up. So nature needs half. While there are absolutely these scientific targets, there's absolutely an ecological, physical, material reason for doing this. Ultimately, nature needs half was started, I don't know, 12 years ago, because it was a transformative vision that imagined a new relationship with nature, one in which society didn't look out in wild areas and see empty lands that were ready to be exploited, but one in which we recognize that nature and the wider web of life require space to live. And as with any relationship we have, we acknowledge that our partner in that relationship has needs as well. And we take on the responsibility to respect those needs. So really, in my mind, nature needs half, and not to sound grandiose, but it's really about reinventing civilization. And in fact, some of the inspiration that came outside of contemporary science for nature needs half, some of the inspiration it offers an alternative view to civilization. And one of the chief shapers of this vision was a gentleman named Herb Norwegian. He is the chief of a tribe in Canada, and I'm not even going to attempt to say the name because I know I'm just going to fumble over it. But Herb Norwegian had already decided that he needed to protect half of the tribal lands. And this came out of traditional knowledge and the idea of reciprocity, that we need to reciprocate. Nature gives us many things. We need to return that to nature in the gifts and respect that we give it. And he was one of the founding leaders of Nature Needs Half. Since then, Nature Needs Half has gained many allies in the Indigenous world, including Cueca, which is the kind of General Assembly of Amazonian tribes. And their criticism of Nature Needs Half is that it's not enough. They have asked the world to protect 80% of the Amazon by 2025. And so they're happy to support Nature Needs Half because they recognize it as a next step, but they're moving to a much more ambitious place. So it's Gwen will talk about this much more than I will. Before I turn this over to her, I just want to acknowledge some kind of feasibility questions. This is a big, ambitious goal. It's not one that the world has signed on to yet. 30 by 30 isn't even one that the world has signed on to yet. A significant number of countries have, but there's been no global agreements about it. But many people want to know, how do we protect half? And so I want to show you this map very quickly, which kind of divides the world into 3 different types of spaces. One is the large wild areas, and those are in the green. One are shared lands, which are black, and one is cities and farms, which are in the red. And what we're imagining as a network is not setting aside half of the planet to look like Yellowstone National Park. That's not it. But it's setting aside half of the planet, protecting especially the wild areas, setting those aside, using local people and Indigenous partners who live in those areas to continue to sustain the land in the ways that they have done so for centuries and millennia, because they are the best stewards of wild areas. But then looking at a way in the shared lands to give ecological integrity primacy, so that we're not continuing to industrialize those areas, build roads on those areas, that type of thing. So this is there are a number of projects that are examples for how to do this. One of them is run by the Wild Foundation in Mali, West Africa, where we are protecting 8 million acres of land in a very rugged, very economically impoverished area. And there's 440,000 people who live on these lands. But because of the habits that they have developed and the culture that's been reinforced there, they can share those lands with the biodiversity in that area, including elephants. And the elephant herds are being restored as a result of that. So I'm going to turn this over to Gwen. If you want to see some of the sources for this presentation, they're right here. Oh, I did want to mention, and I'm so sorry, if you have questions about Wisconsin, please ask them in the Q&A, but I did want to mention Wisconsin. Wisconsin is home to the southern part of one of nature's most important ecosystems, and that's the Boreal Forest. And the reason why the Boreal forests are so freaking important is because they are the largest terrestrial carbon storage in the world. The boreal forests do a fantastic job of storing carbon. Unfortunately, those forests are being fragmented, and we're seeing canaries in the coal mine, so to speak, the loss of moose and things like that, that are suggesting that those forests are deteriorating rapidly. And when a forest deteriorates rapidly, it goes from being a net carbon sink to a net carbon producer. As the forest, as more roads are built in the forest, as forest fires become more common, our forests are going to start working against us unless we protect them. And so Wisconsin is actually the southern edge of a very, very, very important natural carbon sink that must be protected. And I can talk a little bit more about this in Q&A, but I want to hand this over to Gwen now to talk a little bit more about that societal transformation I mentioned and the approach that Indigenous communities take to their relationship with nature.
Thanks,
Oh,
Amy.
and let me introduce Gwen too. Gwen is a conservation, I'm so sorry. There's like all these things I have to do. They're in my mind and I'm not doing them very well at the moment. Gwen is a conservation scientist, an environmental scientist. She brings an enormously important perspective, both in terms of the environmental knowledge that she has, as well as in terms of the cultural knowledge that she has as well. And she has been able to identify through her work and her research the ways in which native law differs from indigenous or from Western law, and what this says about our capacities as communities to protect nature and respect nature. So with that, I turn this over to Gwen.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks you guys at 350 Milwaukee for having me. I hope you can hear me. If not, let me know. But if I can get screen sharing, that would be great while I follow up Amy's excellent introduction with a few more points to begin to introduce my talk. So Amy mentioned my Indigenous perspective. So I'm Saddle Lake Cree. I'm a member of the Saddle Lake Cree Nation. That's out of northern Alberta with the it's north of Edmonton, northeast of Edmonton, if any of you know where that might be. And I've been doing this work and trying to sort of really develop a pragmatic framework for conducting the shifts that we need as society. I really liked when Amy said this reinvention of civilization. I think that's so important that that's the type of space that I believe will obviously need to happen in order to secure not only our environmental imperatives, but our justice imperatives as well for Indigenous people. So I really, really like that because I talk about the need to recreate or redevelop or reimagine this society that we live in. And I'll explain the rationale for my thoughts there, and then as well as some of the frameworks and really delving into what needs to change and how we can begin to think around about what that needs to change. And it's got to do with, as Amy suggested, the nature of our relationship with the animals, plants, the earth, and the inherent authority that they have versus human authority. So I will begin now to try to, slideshow, share this slide. So I wanted to talk about this movement for Nature Needs Half. Obviously, Indigenous people are often, in today's contemporary context, viewed as preservationists, conservationists, nature-centered managers, those kinds of things. Not all Indigenous people are in that vein. There are some who choose to exercise their sovereignty in different ways, i.e. by participating in economic activities, including things like extractive activities. So I don't speak for all Indigenous people. I speak for, the perspective that I believe underpins a lot of the conflict that we have between Western societies' perspectives and operations and Indigenous perspectives and operations. So I'll move through this. I talk about the role of science, Indigenous knowledge, and that notion of responsibility towards things. I would just make this note that I have these, happens to be supper time here in British Columbia, and I have 6-year-old twin boys who are in and out, waiting for their pizza delivery to arrive. So if you hear something or I'm momentarily distracted, that's why. Okay. So, you know, I call this sort of the framework for the future, as Amy suggested, really trying to figure out those pragmatic elements that apply some of these large ideas in the to society, and defining the areas in which we can begin to shape the change that's needed, or guide that policy ship, if you will, or what needs to change. Someone mentioned earlier the need to really have the political representatives on board, and how those things need to change. I'll talk a little bit about, you know, the inherent authority that's we've imbued our leadership with because of our sort of assumptions about the validity of a particular societal structure, which we're embedded in Canada and the United States. And so I'll talk about that. But firstly, I just always want to sort of, you guys really understand this ecological imperative for why we need these better relationships. So I work almost exclusively for Indigenous people, and I advise governments and ENGOs on how to navigate relationships in the interest to better serve the interests of Indigenous people. And I'll share why that's part of the imperative of the direction that the world needs to go as we go forward. But it basically, you know, I do this work because we need to have a better society. We really want to resolve these conflicts that perpetuate inequality. I know there's a lot of issues in the United States which are similar yet often different than in Canada. I think there's a real commonality in some of the Indigenous approaches. Again, I'm really trying to share with you an Indigenous perspective on some of this stuff, not only from my own identity, but from my experience with over 20 years working with tribes in the States, from New Mexico to Washington and now in Canada. And I have met Herb, and he's from the Decho. He's a Grand Chief of the Decho First Nation in the Northwest Territories. And I heard him speak too about some of the notions of the work that we're trying to do around reestablishing those relationships, because we do want things to be better. And so, you know, there's this whole, so I call that sort of the moral imperative, right? And then we have this legal imperative. I know that in Canada, where I'm currently working, but I do work in the States too, governments, including the federal government of Canada and the provincial government of British Columbia, have passed legislation to make all the existing and future legislation consistent with this United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which of course was written by Indigenous people, including those from the Amazon, from Canada, from throughout the world, as a way of providing nation states guidance on what they should do to ensure this more equitable future. And so there's these legal imperatives coming. Out of the States, we have the memo from November 15th from Biden, which said that all federal science agencies should now be incorporating TEK and using TEK in their policy and their work. So there's some consistency there as we begin to see how that gets implemented in the States. And I'll be, you know, working on submitting some of those comments to the White House as well. So, and then of course, you guys are familiar with this ecological imperative. I was at the IUCN, actually met Amy at the IUCN MRSA this past year, and just was so struck by the continued reinforcement of this idea that it's Indigenous land management that will really be our global salvation, because Indigenous peoples do it better, even in areas of where national parks are managed by non-Indigenous people. You know, quantitatively, things like biodiversity are much more the quantifiably much more better on Indigenous managed lands. Like, we know that 80% of the world's biodiversity remains within Indigenous managed lands. So I'll talk about why that is, and why it's such a challenge to really begin to learn from and apply those types of methodologies more broadly because of our societal constraints. So, you know, in my work, you know, what we need to do in order to do this work is we need to understand the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We need to understand reconciliation. It's a real buzzword in Canada now to sort of think about what it means to reconcile the past injustices and move forward in a fair way, really, in a reconciled way. And then what needs to reconcile? What are those roots of conflict which are really at the most fundamental level of this conflict that we experience when we think about different ways of viewing land and its resources, right? And then this challenge, I'll frame these challenges in the context of this concept called ethical space, which is really about how we begin to work through these deep challenges, which are really striving to discuss those very fundamental underpinnings of that different worldview and those different perspectives, that different legislative framework even. So, and then, the point that I really like in this concept of ethical space, which I'll discuss in this presentation, is that it's really about this creative space, this open-minded space, this bringing what we need to understand from the best of what we both practice in terms of different societies and explore that. So it's still resonating in my mind what Amy said about reinventing civilization. So that's really when we get to realize, our place, our role, our opportunity in that space, then it's quite exciting. And yeah, so UNDRIP, I don't know how many of you have read the 46 articles of UNDRIP, but they're really quite good. There's 17 of them which are really land focused, really related to Indigenous land management and the rights associated with the ability for Indigenous people to reinvigorate those rights and things like that, right? So, and I just talked about Canada's endorsement. US hasn't really re-endorsed it after the Obama did in 2010 with caveats, so we see Biden really leaning on UNDRIP to support the work in these new policy initiatives to include Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge within the work of the federal agencies. And I mentioned our conservation goals, trying to protect half or more, and do it in a way that's really going to be supportive of all of the people the 1.4 billion who rely on it, as well as all of us who rely on all those ecosystem services. So UNDRIP, basically, I reflect on a lot. People talk about a lot. I think it's less in the sort of daily lexicon, perhaps in the United States, but really it obligates the nation states who decide to sign it, endorse it, to acknowledge and recognize Indigenous rights, to protect those Indigenous rights, and then to pay to protect, redress, or mitigate impacts to those rights. So this is kind of the three-tiered approach outlined in UNDRIP for nation states, describes their obligations. So there's some specific things here, and I won't necessarily belabor these, but Amy mentioned this need for economic reckoning, really, around how we begin to think of some of the opportunities that present themselves when we're considering building economies on sustainability or conservation. From the Indigenous perspective, there's a whole lot of work that needs to be framed around how Indigenous people develop the economic rationale for describing alternative futures built on sustainability and cultural reinvigoration, really, to apply those ways of being that result in better ecological outcomes. For example, the 80% biodiversity and clean water and things like that. One of the consistent challenges of Indigenous communities are the capacity limitations. And so the ability for First Nations to begin to describe that robust economic rationale in a way that can be understood by the parties on the opposite side of the table. I do a lot of these negotiations on the opposite side of the table. They're saying, oh, as an example, this conservation proposal or this new Indigenous management regime is going to cost 800 jobs. Therefore, we can't do it. So this is a real area of interest for me in beginning to understand and create that economic rationale, to describe that economic rationale for conservation-based future economies. And I think it's imperative for the Indigenous people to do it because they're beginning to have this authority reinstated or sort of the impositions removed from pressing down on those economic realities. So they begin to have the recognition of their authority over the land from which economic benefits derive. And so they're well positioned to have these conversations as they emerge as legitimate. Not that we need to legitimize, but that other governments will have conversations now with Indigenous governments where before they wouldn't. So we need to be able to have sort of equitable and even playing field conversations around economics. An area of interest for me, which is why I kind of feel like I belabored that point. I'm working on developing those things. Oops, this is, anyways, I don't know why it's this. I mentioned global reckoning. I have to work on my slides. So, Article 24 talks about the right for Indigenous people for conservation. That's critical in this conversation around 30 by 30, nature needs half, all of Indigenous-led conservation. There's quite a few cross-border initiatives which were mentioned in the Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada and President Biden's roadmap going forward, really thinking about, some of the conservation imperatives for that cross-boundary area, including perhaps Wisconsin and its connection to the broader Boreal Forest. I'm going to talk about Indigenous law. I talk about Indigenous knowledge. I want to talk about Indigenous law. So Indigenous knowledge includes Indigenous law. Indigenous law is information which guides the behavior of the participants within society. That's what law does, right? People act individually in accordance with particular laws. And so Indigenous people are really beginning to articulate and codify their Indigenous law derived from stories, derived from ceremony and traditions, derived from language, for example, into a format that is more easily understood by non-Indigenous people, I guess, and organizations, right? So this body of work about Indigenous law, it's a burgeoning area where soon you'll see Indigenous people present these documents which say this is our law, right? And then what follows that here in UNDRIP, it clearly states that not only will be these Indigenous laws, and that really we're going to need to establish and implement Indigenous law across this broader society if we're going to truly commit to what we're saying we're going to do with UNDRIP, is to say, okay, we're going to have these laws, then we're going to have adjudication mechanisms, Indigenous adjudication mechanisms, tribunals, courts, judges, et cetera, that will determine whether an entity is in violation of that Indigenous law. And then subsequently penalties to be applied for violation, or consequences to be applied when those laws are violated, right? So this assertion of governance mechanisms around laws and adjudication and consequences is an area where we'll find lots of Indigenous people beginning to work in that space. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. I just think the pizza might be here. Sorry, 1 second.
While Gwen goes and gets pizza, and thank you everybody for understanding that we are human and have these other things going on in our lives. But while Gwen goes to retrieve the pizza for her sons, I just want to address a comment I received from Michael, so I don't have to do so in the Q&A. And Michael corrected me gently on not being able to pronounce Herb Norwegian's tribe's name, which, thank you, Gwen, is the Dene Decho. I find that when I've done that in the past, I always switch the two words. But Michael rightly called me out for being disrespectful. And I want to acknowledge that it was disrespectful, that unintentionally so, but still disrespectful, that I did not pronounce that correctly and didn't even attempt to pronounce it. And I want to apologize to Herb, to Gwen, and to all of you, and just know that I have been corrected, and I will be more careful about that in the future. Gwen, continue, please.
Thank you for that interlude, and
thank you.
It's important. There's always a balance between trying to pronounce something and then butchering it. Some people find that really challenging if they're an Indigenous speaker, and some people are okay with it. I found, the whole spectrum. So I tend to err on the side of trying.
I've erred on that side too. Trust me, I've erred.
That's part of this work, is the reinvigoration of Indigenous languages and all of that place names work and things like that. I think, in relation to this slide, thinking about the nature of Indigenous knowledge, and that, if science is an earth-based observational methodology, and so is sort of Indigenous knowledge, we are cognizant of that when we think about sort of science, but then really we are understanding, and I'll describe some of those components, that Indigenous knowledge is so much more than science. So I put this here not to, well, to say that when we think about science, and I have a master's of science in hydrology, so I do understand that methodology, but when we're talking about Indigenous sciences, we're pulling much further back and looking from a much more holistic perspective. So I just would make that note here. Okay, I know probably, well, I know also that recently Secretary Haaland has initiated something along the lines of what's happened in Canada related to the residential school system investigation. So she said, well, we know that there's these bodies of children, et cetera. We're going to begin to understand a little bit more what happened there. Canada had went through this process, which concluded in 2015, of trying to understand and provide ways to reconcile and provide restitution to those communities, families, individuals who were hurt by the residential school system. My mom went to residential school at Blue Quills residential school for 11 years. And there were definitely long-lasting impacts. And even now I'm 48 and I'm beginning over the past few years to understand some of those, what they're calling intergenerational impacts from that experience. My mother, my grandmother in the residential school system. So Canada had done this Truth and Reconciliation Commission work through that period of time, many volumes. You can Google it. It's a challenging read. I couldn't read it all because it's so distressing, but they got through it. And they presented 94 calls to action for the federal government and provincial government, and as you can see here, territorial municipal governments, to do this work towards, reconciliation, right? And so, right, sort of thinking about how we begin to deal with the past. And so, there's 94 of them. Many of them are good in language, culture, education, social systems, healthcare, these kinds of things. There's fewer as compared to UNDRIP, for example, which directly reference the relationship needed between, or the relationship between Indigenous people and the land. And so when we thought about, well, when I thought about that, and then I came across materials that Indigenous peoples and others had worked on, which found that in the broader commission report, almost like a fundamental principle, before you could achieve these other 94 calls to action, you really had to work on one fundamental premise, right? And it said basically that in order to reconcile, the first relationship that must heal is the relationship of Indigenous people to their land, right? And so in Canada, we're talking a lot about reconciliation. You'll probably, as that residential school stuff comes more and more to light in the States, begin to talk about reconciliation. I think it'll certainly come up in the context of, how you describe policy approaches as per Biden's memo in the context of conflict resolution, right? And so I keep this in mind because if we're going to try and resolve these conflicts, and we call ourselves reconciliationists, I guess, right? Which I certainly am working in this space all the time, that all of our work is essentially and is required to be almost exclusively in the service of Indigenous people healing their relationship to the land. If we're going to achieve outcomes like what was described at the IUCN, like Nature Needs Half, like Indigenous people reinvigorating their management techniques, this is what we're all in service of. And so that to me is really profound. One of the mechanisms to do that, there's many, one of the mechanisms here is called out specifically in these calls to action in action number 47. We call upon all levels of government to repudiate concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous peoples and lands, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, and to reform those laws, government policies, and litigation strategies continue to rely on such concepts. Now, here's a little bit of a difference, is because the United States has sort of divorced itself from the colonial history constitutionally, whereas Canada has yet not done so. We're still, our head of state is still, go look in the van. Our head of state is still the Queen of England, right? And so we still have a lot of these legacy pieces around doctrine of discovery, which was also part of the whole rationale for the colonial approach to the North American continent, whether, however that shaped out between the United States and Canada, i.e. the states had a revolution and we didn't, separate itself from some of those more colonial approaches. But fundamentally, the structure of society in the United States is very much built upon what I'll talk about earlier, or I'll talk about later, in relation to where the authority for how we make decisions about the land comes from. I would, take the keys. I would say that, reconciliation, fundamentally this idea of resolving conflict, right? And reconciliation doesn't have one definition. There's no, look, this is it, right? It really depends. And in Canada, there's lots of people who are like, reconciliation is a failure, right? Because there's different ways of thinking what reconciliation is. And a lot of the work that's being done is really sort of topical or very limited spatially. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And so my point here is that reconciliation moves much deeper. And I'll suggest what I mean by that in a moment. But here I would say that I really like this metaphor of two-eyed seeing, which you guys probably have heard about, or walking on two legs. There's other metaphors, braiding ways of knowing, this kind of stuff. I really like this two-eyed seeing because it provides a real tangible metaphor from my perspective in what we need to do if we're going to reconcile. So if you see out of one eye, you cover one eye and you see one eye, you see it look out of one eye and you look towards a target. You can focus on that target, set your vision, but then you open the other eye and that target moves, right? And you shift the eye, the target is moving. And so it's really important to develop that vision for what we want to achieve when we think about reconciled approaches or reconciled visions or this reimagined civilization together, right? And I think this is the challenge when we think about how we do that. And I love this framework that Reg Croshu, a Piikani out of Alberta at the University of Calgary, uses and references and practices called ethical space. He built on some work of Willie Ermine, also a Cree, I think, I forget what University of Calgary also, I think. But anyways, this ethical space is really how we have conversations which are so challenging, which are designed to begin to imagine something new, built on this deep understanding and reconciling some of these deep roots of conflict. And so I talked about this metaphor of two-eyed seeing, right? And so the input from whether you're looking from the Indigenous eye or the non-Indigenous eye, it needs to come together in some kind of way. When we actually use the metaphor of the eye, that space that consolidates that understanding and creates that cohesive vision is this brain, is our brain, right? And I don't know what happens there, neuroscientists do or whatever, but I really like that metaphor because his framework for this ethical space concept is really, really beautiful. I really like it. And if you guys get this chance to review this document called Voice of Understanding by the Alberta Energy Regulator, where he frames out this description of ethical space really simplistically yet very coherently. And he's a wonderful speaker. If you Google him, he has some ethical space talks, which you might enjoy. So really what he says here is that what we're trying to do is to create something new. So that's the premise, right? It's a creative space. And what it needs to, there's a couple of responsibilities of these parties on either side. It is to bring forward what's important to be understood into the space so that the other can understand, right? So the Indigenous has to bring their side, the Western has to bring their side. There's this conversation, these challenging concepts and the creation of something new. He says this should happen in these spaces of cultural safety, which is really about understanding cultural protocols. For example, like he talked about where you sit in a teepee, order speaking, tobacco ceremonies, different kinds of things, right? And those are all culturally specific, but that's important in terms of cultural safety, how we understand the processes of meetings themselves, like in non-Indigenous meetings, you'll say things that are signals, right? Like, oh, let's get this meeting back on track, which connotates, well, now we're going to hear something important. Working in cultural safety in Indigenous communities, those signals aren't there. So we have to learn a new way of understanding and recognizing when important things are being said. it's been my experience that oftentimes those types of that conveyance of information in a much different sense, a casual sense, a story sense over lunch, those types of important conversations are missed. That's an exercise in building listening skills, and there's other work and sharing, I talk about that. But this point is like, well, what do we need to bring forward into this space, right? And so what we need to do to bring forward into this space is this idea of well, what's in the Western culture, right? And this is just not an exhaustive list, it's just, you know, the first crack at it. So things like politicians and what they represent and their authority, science, religion, values, patriarchy, this age of enlightenment, or the concept of beginning to think from a reductionist perspective when observing natural phenomena, for example, democratic governance, the history associated with that, out of the Greek tradition, for example, and constitutions and things like that. Again, you know, all of that stuff coming forward. I would argue that a lot of that stuff has been brought into maybe not yet an ethical space, but has been communicated and deeply understood by Indigenous people through things like the imposition of, in Canada, the Indian Act, and in both countries, things like the residential schools, all of those kinds of things that happened that imposed you know, American or Canadian culture, colonial culture upon Indigenous people. Very well understood by Indigenous people. Often people are like, my friend was like, well, you go to a meeting and Indigenous people are always spouting elements of constitutional law, sections, case law, all this kind of stuff, right? Even stuff that a lot of Canadians don't know, right? Even those who are tasked with negotiating some of these agreements. On the Indigenous side, what's really important to bring into that space in order to be deeply understood? What's important to be understood in order to have conversations which will support and advance reconciliation? Things like traditional ecological knowledge, stories, protocols derived from those stories, the notion of chieftainship and what those roles are, different sets of values, Indigenous governance, which is not necessarily democratic, for example, spirituality as an important component in decision-making, which is not very often considered on the non-Indigenous side, community processes of engagement and decision-making as well. So again, all of those things are less well understood, I would propose, by non-Indigenous people and need to be brought forward. The onus, Reg says, is on the Indigenous nation for both parties to bring forward what's important to be understood. This places the onus and the responsibility on Indigenous people to do that work. And I make this contrast to some of the stuff I heard, for example, in the Black Lives Matter movement, where people were like, hey, it's not my responsibility to teach you, you know, I'm tired, go read a book or whatever. One of the challenges on the Indigenous side, particularly in Canada, is that a lot of that information has not yet been communicated in history, in documents. It hasn't been documented. There's been such a sort of systemic subjugation and pushing down of all of that information that it needs a lot of work to uplift it. I'll just take a drink here. So when we talk about what's required to be understood in that ethical space, to create something new, to create a new way of managing our societies, this is sort of my offering to that space, if you will, right? What is important to be understood? I was questioning with my colleague, Rob Edward, who's a Similkameen elder, what are the deepest roots of the conflict that continue to perpetuate this frustration within relationships, right? So I go and negotiate on behalf of Indigenous peoples, and you end up doing things like negotiating over, you know, are you gonna harvest cedar trees for lumber, or are you gonna do it for, cedar bark picking for whatever? Or are you going to harvest are you going to log in a blueberry patch, or are you going to save that blueberry patch in order to provide some sustenance opportunities for Indigenous people, right? So you'd have these conversations which are really about, sort of I mentioned before, sort of topic specific or place spatially specific. And you'd sort of, okay, well, today we're going to log here and tomorrow we're going to protect those blueberry areas, right? So you would have some kind of resolution on that level, but it always was a dissatisfaction on the Indigenous side because you still didn't feel understood. You still didn't really have this understanding that that other side was getting you, right? Why it's so important for those things to happen, right? So we began to think, well, you know, how far do we peel back this onion in order to think about what those where those conflicts lie, and how do we, if we're obligated to ethical space to bring it forward in a way that's understood, communicate some of these differences. So this is why this is in a hierarchy here. Let's take another drink. Okay, so here we have, I'll just explain that because this is often the most effective way to do this. And I have this little drawing implement, and if you can see it, let me know. Oops, so yes, you can see that. Someone indicate with a thumbs up. I can only see like 3 people.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Right, that's great. So so I put this you know, sort of these roots of conflict, as far as I see them, in this, framing it within this ethical space, right? And so, you know, and this sort of framework, I call it the dual authoritative hierarchical framework, if you want to get complicated, but it's really based on my experience, my identity, my relationships, my work, right? And so my caveat always is it's not a pan-Indigenous framework. If others have other ideas or anything, that's totally awesome. I'm not attempting to speak for every Indigenous person in North America or every society or anything like that, right? But I would say that it's informed through those experiences and through the thought processes that we applied to thinking through what's necessary to achieve reconciliation. So it's bringing forward this understanding. So I'll just describe it. I think that's the best way, is just to get into it, right? So we thought, and I mentioned earlier, like law is the way that guides the way people behave, right? We behave the way we behave in society because we're conditioned and socialized and embody the laws and rules that are part, and beliefs and values and mores of that society of which we're part, right? And so what are all of those things that are guiding the way we behave and what we believe to be true, right? Where does the authority for the impacts on our behavior come from, right? And so we began to think, well, on the Western side, you know, in our sort of Western Judeo-Christian culture, which, you know, America is certainly a product of, right? And I, you know, even though America doesn't have the Queen as a head of state, you know, it's still very much attached to this notion of God, right? I don't know. I've reviewed your constitution, but you say things like "In God we trust" and "God bless America" and all this kind of stuff, right? So this notion that God has this imbued authority over this society is one that resonates with all of us, right? It resonates with most people because even on the Indigenous side, we have this notion of creator, right? And most societies have this notion of creator, right? All of this sort of authority or this creation, the authority that comes inherent with the ability to create a universe is well recognized by humans and human societies, right? So we have this entity which says, okay, I create all the earth, the animals, the things on it, the water, the stars, the space, the air, et cetera, et cetera. And so then what does that God do then, right? So on the Western side, the God then says, okay, I create you humans and all the things on it. On the Western side, the God says, well, you humans, you get to decide what happens to the earth. You get to care for, decide what the earth looks like, consider whether or not you want to harvest the animals, consider whether or not you'd like to farm. Basically, you have this authority. On the Christian concept, we sort of view this through this concept of dominion, which is sort of this biblical concept that God provides to humans to make decisions about what happens on the earth, right? I put Queen here because in the Canadian context, as the Queen is very much ahead of our state, this linkage between the way that we behave to this sort of highest level of authority, i.e. the Queen, which is kind of delegated from God, this authority. My American colleagues, of course, said, no, we don't have a Queen, but that's this human entity. So that's why that is there. This demonstration of the direct lineage of you know, the way we behave, our laws to God in the Western sense in Canada is described through things like the Constitution Act, which contains this Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. and I'll sort of segue into an example now. So I was negotiating this agreement, and the federal government in Canada is saying, well, we should include the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. I'm like, well, that sounds awesome. There's probably a lot of good stuff in there. But what the first line of that Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms says is, we believe in the supremacy of God. Right. And so what's inherent in that is that we believe in the supremacy of a God which delegated authority to human entities. So when we're on the Indigenous side, we're like, well, that's not just going to work for us, because on the Indigenous side, when the Creator came and created Earth and all the things on it, all the animals, it delegated authority to those animals. It delegated the authority for the determination about what happens to the Earth and the Earth systems and relationships to the animals and plants themselves. I use the Okanagan example because I've kind of been embedded with them for 12 years, negotiating a national park with them, and learned a lot and listened as much as possible. And they're very forthcoming with sharing their creation story, wherein this is described. The Creator said to the, in this case, the black bear, the salmon, the bitterroot, which is a little flowery plant, a root plant, and the Saskatoon berry, the Creator said, okay, you entities, there's these humans, which I happen to also create, which you get to decide the fate of. They're coming, they don't have any fur or proper teeth, they can't keep warm, and they can't kill their own food with their teeth or whatever. So you animals need to decide what happens to them, right? You are having your own relationships, you determine your own obligations to each other, and you determine the obligations of humans to yourselves, right? So the animals got around and they said, hey, well, okay, we're going to help these humans live. We're going to give them our bodies, and in turn, they have these obligations to perform ceremonies or whatever to us, right? So there's this reciprocity that's established there. But the essential point at this highest level is that the Creator gave the legal authority for the decisions about what happens to the earth to the animals themselves, not humans. And so the animals themselves get to dictate to humans their fate, not vice versa, right? And so then that information was conveyed through story. Those stories contain protocols. Those protocols, have these management prescriptions, which are, how you go about your managing your things. And then ultimately, sort of the Indigenous groups, they live by that that hierarchy of authority. The highest level of that authority is imbued within the animals themselves, and that traditional ecological knowledge is conveyed through story, right? This is on the Western side, sort of God says, okay, humans, you get to have authority, and so constitutions come out of there, and various other legislative components, policies, and then management. And I'll leave science there just for now, as I begin to talk a little bit more about this. I make this. I state this at some point, and I'll state it now, is that this is not a value judgment on either, on the credibility or validity of either system, right? They are just two systems which happen to exist from the infinite possibility, I'd imagine, derived from this metaphysical ether, right? Like, okay, well, they just happen to be there. Why would one way of understanding, why would one way of being, why would one way of imbuing authority into a certain species or sets of species be any better than the other, right? And so I make this caveat, like, this is the point of ethical space, is to bring forward what's been able to understand without judgment, and to, Reg talks about this cross-validation, understanding that this way of understanding this authority is just as valid as any other authority, right? And so,
Yeah, Gwen,
yeah.
this is Linda. So would this be a good point then to maybe move into the question and answer period? We have 15 minutes left of our session. Is there something else you wanted to cover before we move into that?
Yeah, I'll just talk about science briefly for 2 minutes, and then we'll get into questions for sure. Okay, so I wanted to make this point that science is a way of observing the earth. The stories that contain this information about what happens with the animals is also an earth-based observation methodology. One of the challenges that's happening today, maybe within your conservation circles, certainly within mine, is this conversation around, well, we should just include traditional knowledge as a complement, as an equitable input into our management documents. And then, we'll learn and everything will be better and we'll just have better documents, right? We'll have better plans and all this kind of stuff. Well, that's really awesome, except when you're proposing to include traditional ecological knowledge about this very highest level of the law to is, for example, management plannings, where we say, we hope this plan will inform policy. You've all been in that space, right? And then you get it to the policymaker and they're like, oh, well, my buddy doesn't want that, or I got no money, or it's got to be consistent with this other law, right? And so all of this scientific information and management planning is subject to this policy validation loop, right? And this is the challenge that we have now, in that the scientific information, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's water, I just read half the water in the United States is like totally polluted beyond drinkable and swimmable and all that kind of stuff, right? So science, the Earth information is being told via scientists that something needs to be done. So the scientists are observing the Earth. They're saying, they're taking analysis and data, analyzing it, drawing conclusions, making recommendations that say, for example, stop heating the Earth, or our water's dying, or we got no biodiversity, these things are bad. But that doesn't change the way people behave. So the inherent authority of that information, that Earth truth, if you will, doesn't have any inherent legal weight. Whereas on what the Earth says on the Indigenous side carries the utmost of legal weight. So people actually behave in accordance with that. The challenge of trying to include that TEK in some of these and subject it to a policy validation loop is that you're subjecting all of that Indigenous knowledge on that side to this policy validation feedback loop. And so the question is, in terms of conflict, why would an Indigenous group do that? Why would an Indigenous people, person, entity do that? I have lots more to say on this, and I could go a little bit more into decision making, but if we want to break now, I think this is a good time to break, and we can have some conversation if there are questions.
Okay. Can we see the, can we take away the screen on here and we get all of the people? Okay, it's good. Greg, can you and I take care of this? George couldn't, he had someplace to go. He can't stick around to help with the questions. So, Greg, if you can help with that, please.
And I think everybody knows, raise your hand in the reactions, and if you want to join the queue. And at the top of the queue currently is Jan. So Jan, why don't you?
Thank you so much for this very important presentation. I'm wondering if you could elaborate more on what you mean by the reinvention of civilization. Are you talking about personal habits or things can be done for the general good? And what is the most important thing that we need to concentrate on in that respect?
So when I shared that framework, right, about ethical space being a way to take what's important from those societies, have those conversations, and reimagine a future based on drilling down through what needs to reconcile in terms of that authority. So what needs to reconcile is the highest level of the authority, right? The human entity has this assumed jurisdiction, if you will, from the godly creation. And then on the Indigenous side, the animals have the authority. So we should be listening to the animals. You hear this in Indigenous circles as Indigenous law, right? But then the point of this is like, okay, well, how do we reconcile that we have on one side the animals dictating what we should do, on the other side the humans dictating what we should do, right? And so there's a process that follows that I'll describe at some other point about how we make decisions based on those assumed authorities. But the conversation needs to be ultimately, and over time, how we begin to reconcile those very different but equally they're on the same level of authority, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's the conversation we need to have in terms of how you begin to inform, for example, policy down here and legislation and constitution. Canada's asserted that they want to work on that challenge through their commitment to UNDRIP, but the challenge is very, very difficult, and I'm not sure they've yet reconciled that that's the kind of conversation that's meant by, that's sort of proposed by UNDRIP. They're still working on sort of, well, if we just kind of include TEK and then we'll inform our policy and everything will be good. And my argument is that that's not good. Like, that's not what Indigenous people have been saying. And so this is one framework for how we begin to say, well, what are Indigenous people saying in a way that might be more more easily understood by non-Indigenous, for example, right? So.
And,
Okay,
and
thank you.
I just want to add to this just very quickly. And I think that Gwen's information is absolutely necessary for structuring that conversation moving forward. The kind of more simplistic heuristic from the Nature Needs Half perspective is that of a relationship, right? And if we think about, two partners trying to make it through the world together, and if one of those partners have all the authority and the other one's just there to give feedback and listen or to say things, but all the decisions are based on what the other partner says, that relationship probably isn't going to last too long. And so when we say nature needs half, what we're saying is, and I don't think this was necessarily, most of the original founders wouldn't have said this, but what Gwen is adding to this conversation is that we're giving nature half of the space, but we're also giving nature a place of authority to dictate its needs to us. And that would be new for Western civilization, because nature has always existed in Western civilization to be taken from, but not to be returned to.
Or listened to, like in a very direct sense, right?
Okay, thank you.
Chris, you're next on the queue.
I really appreciate you both talking to us, and it was quite enlightening. What I'm trying to get my head around is this: the level of authority seems to be the inverse of the level of what is right. I absolutely I agree with you with the native side that the animals should be in charge of us versus us in charge of the animals. But so I think that what you're saying is right, but the people with the authority are saying exactly the opposite. And I really don't understand at what point you could find even a common consensus with people. I mean, there I was giving money to save the wolves just so that somebody else could go out and shoot them or trap them with their dogs. Where would you find a consensus?
I think that this is a new area of work, right? It's not been done because Indigenous people haven't been part of any kind of conversation, right? They've been subjects and subjugated genocide committed against, and their worldviews not taken seriously. So this is a conversation which is emerging. And it's a conversation which is emerging because in Canada's case, the nation state has recognized and committed to having that conversation through UNDRIP. Now I have this problem because we're able to have this conversation where we can have these types of discussions and point out the places and levels where we need to have this reconciliation because of the benevolence of the nation state to adopt UNDRIP. So I always reflect upon that, right? It's not, so anyways, I guess that's just a little caveat. And so this is the challenge. So right now, like in Canada, I'm really working hard on the policy pieces, right? So trying to influence policy, trying to describe this level of authority and the challenges that are needed at multiple levels right now in the policy sphere, right? And so, but what Canada has committed to, and British Columbia, is to have those conversations at the legislative level, which is getting to an appropriate level, right? You're saying, okay, this is what our legislation says. For example, national parks don't pollute, don't pick, endangered species, whatever, right? And on various levels of authority contained within the story on the Indigenous side say parallel things. So when we're negotiating agreements, we draw out from the appropriate levels these types of guidance. What are similar guidances for building, for constraining the behavior of the societal participants? Don't pollute, don't litter, don't pick out a season. Okay, horse story says the same things, or coyote's eye story says the same things. Don't pollute, don't pick out a season, those kind of things. So where you can draw those parallels begins to create that consensus around, okay, we're talking at the same level of authority. We can provide similar guidance to our collective societal participants by the assertion and implementation and adherence to these both laws, right? Conservation and National Parks Act, Species at Risk Act, things like that provide a good starting point because they are really based on sort of that conservation ethic, right? So I'll stop there.
I'm not a conservation scientist or biological scientist like Gwen is, or I guess hydrological scientist. I don't know if that fits into biological. I don't think it does. But I'm a social scientist, and I'm both a practitioner of social movements as well as a scholar of social movements. And the last people I need to be telling about social movement building is you guys, because you are on the front lines of that. But I will say this, that there's something that kind of annoys me a little bit, just a little bit, in the environmental dialogue. And that's like, oh, we're all about talking and no action. And I do agree, we need way more action, right? But talking and listening is essentially the first step to building a social movement, an effective one, especially when it's with these new cutting edge ideas, whether it's like, we need to keep temperature rise under 1.5 degrees, or we need to protect half the planet, or we need to include Indigenous people as leaders in this movement. And being able to have a table that's inclusive, and not necessarily inclusive for inclusivity's sake. That's just, and it's right, but we need it to be inclusive for problem solving sake, right? Because there are people in this world that are living a solution, and they probably have some knowledge we could use and benefit from as we go about these decisions. So is there a consensus now? No. Does that mean there won't be a consensus in the future? Absolutely not. Think about how the world has changed. Women have the vote. We have some notion of civil rights, even though it's been imperfectly implemented, right? So we are changing, we're evolving. And what essentially is happening now is we're saying, okay, in order for us to make this next step ecologically, we have to become more inclusive, and we have to start developing a consensus in this area.
Thank you. Linda.
And thank you, Gwen and Amy, for your presentations. I want to ask about where we stand with Indigenous guardians for stewardship of lands in the US. Given that we don't have a reconciliation process here, we don't have all that is going on in Canada. But I also wanted to make mention in connection with the previous question from Chris, that there hasn't been a mention so far of the rights of nature movement, and the fact that rights of nature laws have been adopted in several locations in the US as well as other places in the world. And it occurs to me that that's not always connected with Indigenous people, but it seems to me that that Indigenous ecological knowledge is needed in that space in interpreting and implementing these rights of nature. So I had two questions there.
Thanks. I think rights of nature is really great, for sure. And we're moving through this transitionary period, I think, where we're beginning to understand the rights of nature from this Indigenous legal perspective. And I think we'll only grow more into it. So I think these steps to give water rights and these kinds of things is really imperative. The Guardians programs in Canada are getting underway. And I'm not sure of the status in the States. One thing I know about the States, having worked there and in Canada, is there is a lot more, although not sufficient, funding for ecological management programs through the BIA and the EPA and the BLM, for example, which don't exist in Canada. So in that way, Canada's playing a bit of a catch up there, but the Guardians programs are being built in a model that supports Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous-based monitoring, and traditional knowledge-based ways of sort of observing the earth and those kinds of things. So I can't really speak to American Guardians programs.
Thank you. Since no one else has raised their hand, I'm going to jump in here. I found your discussion of the ethical space very enlightening to begin with. You mentioned, one of you mentioned that the Nature Needs Half movement has been around for about a dozen years. And I don't know how long you've been discussing that ethical space, but have you seen any movement towards the center? And maybe the movement mostly has to come from the Western point of view. Have you seen any change there, or very much change?
I'll speak from my example, which negotiating this national park agreement with the federal government. Yeah, this is where we're practicing. If we're practitioners of ethical space and the things that we're doing, you know, we've had good luck with this particular Parks Canada arm of the federal government, if you will. I wouldn't speak for all of the federal government, in being receptive and open to understanding, learning, and applying Indigenous law and Indigenous concepts within the agreement and within the relationships that support that agreement. So yeah, that is, other governments like the provincial government in British Columbia, it's still a big challenge. And I think in terms of Biden's initiative for TEK, that's going to be also a big challenge, just because I feel some of these concepts around the need for societal shifts are particularly unpalatable to the Americans because of their sort of much more deeply identification with the American system and the Constitution, because it was born out of that revolutionary context, right, which we don't have in Canada. We're much less attached to the Queen, for example, than you might be to some of your more American things. So I think that challenge will be a kind of cool discussion to happen in the States as well. But there are some examples, people are practicing it. It's a slow go. But I'm, I suppose, to follow the sort of religious metaphors, I'm a bit of a missionary for ethical space, and I go around and talk about it and stuff like that. So,
from my perspective, in Western conservation, there's been movement, yes, and there's definitely been more of acknowledgement, at least rhetorically, around the inclusion of Indigenous people and concern for them. But I want to caveat this, because I think we are all operating from a place of ignorance. Like, until we have that really well-developed ethical space that Gwen talks about, we really don't know what we're doing. At least I don't know what I'm doing. Like, all I know is that it needs to be done, and that there's something here that's important. And I submit myself to this process as a willing student. So acknowledging that, I think a lot of the stuff that's happening both nationally and internationally around giving lip service to Indigenous people is a step in the right direction, but it's a small step, because I think that most of us are unaware about how much that needs to be done. And so that's one. Two, in terms of Nature Needs Half, you know, a lot of the resistance that we have seen ostensibly doesn't come from Indigenous people, but it comes from Western people who are using Indigenous rights as a reason to not participate in large scale conservation. So probably one of the biggest critiques I get about Nature Needs Half is, oh, we can't do that because of the implication for Indigenous people. And my response is like, really? So that's another barrier that we have to overcome. And I don't feel like it's my place as a Western conservationist to overcome that. I can't overcome that. I cannot speak for a culture that is not my own. All I know is that Nature Needs Half is the scientific consensus. It was done with the best of intentions and with the inclusion of Indigenous people as part of the vision. And that going forward, it must have Indigenous inclusion, not just participation, but at the leadership level, so that we do it in the right way, in the ethical way.
I can follow up, you're each from different sides of the border. And there are, from the Western point of view, there are some cultural differences, but the US and Canada are pretty similar in a lot of ways. In the US, there's a lot of, I don't know how to put it best, but there's a lot of resistance to giving nature even 10%, I suppose. Is that true in Canada too?
Canada comes from a different place entirely. It's the second largest country in the world with a minuscule population of 33 million, right? So the history of Canada has been, hey, we can conserve, we'll just put off this 1 million hectares here and no one will ever go there and we don't have to think about it much more anyways, right? And so that's on the conservation side, some of those opportunities have availed themselves, and we have nice national parks. We still need to do a lot more work. And that's the challenge of 30 by 30 is that most of the land is owned by the provinces. The provinces have taken this approach like a petulant toddler, I liken it to, that they just go around and they just sort of destroy things with impunity and, even worse than my toddlers ever were, right? Like cut down things and dig big holes and never fill them in properly and other people trip on them and stuff like that, right? So flying back from Marseille, right, and going over the province, it's a huge province and it's entirely decimated, right? And so the challenge for, I'm really familiar with the BC context, and it may be true for other provinces, is they don't want to give up their sort of myopic, spoiled toddler way of doing things. And Canada's 150 years old. It can't be any other way. That's the way it is, right? It's always just extracted these resources. So it's extraordinarily resistant to potential impacts to the land base that supports that sort of way of being, that economic activity, right? And that's why I talked about the need to really reframe from a mature perspective a different economic future. And that's not happening in these conversations. And they're shut down literally in meetings with Indigenous people trying to have those conversations by not being able to have the conversations from the economic science point of view, right? So there is a lot of resistance. Some of, quite a bit of Canada is protected. So some people are like, well, we've already done enough. But so that is not a great answer, but there's certainly resistance for sure.
Yeah, we've been talking about Enbridge for the last going on a year, what's going on in right in your backyard. And yeah, it's scary. However, I guess we're 10 minutes past when we'd ask you to stay. Thank you very much. It was a fantastic evening and presentation. Thank you for both very much. I give this back to Julie.
I think we do need to close for the evening. We thank our guests very much for the presentation. Gives us a lot more to think about and hopefully to act on. And once again, remember that Friday, April 22nd is Earth Day, and we'll be having our big rally and march in front of Milwaukee City Hall, 12 noon. Please be there, bring your friends and family. And we need to have a strong presence, both at the city level and at Chase Bank. So thank you for being here tonight. And I think we can say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Night. Night.
Good night.